Okay, good. That one's easy. Well, thank you all very much for coming. My name is Will Hedberg. I'm the Associate Director for the Center for Asian Research. And it's really a great pleasure to welcome you to the CAR Faculty and Graduate Student Research in Progress Workshop, forum for faculty, for graduate students, for CAR affiliates to present their research, current projects, recent publications, etc., in an informal and collegial atmosphere. Despite the challenges, we're really, really excited to have our first in-person session, or at least partially in-person session. We're very delighted to welcome our new colleague, Nick Williams, who joins us this year in Silk from the University of Hong Kong. Professor Williams is an expert of many, many, many things. He's an associate professor of Chinese literature with wide-ranging expertise in medieval Chinese poetry, medieval Japanese poetry, Sino-Japanese literary relations, Buddhist studies, translation, and intellectual history. He's the author of many, many monographs, articles, edited volumes, translations, many more than I could list right here. Some of them include Imitation of the Self, Jiangyan and Chinese Poetics, The Residue of Dreams, The Fu Genre of Imperial China, and he has a forthcoming complete translation of the lyrics of Chu, and has just published an article which I believe is related to the topic of the talk today, Beyond Arbitrariness, Kukai's Theory of Language and Scripts. We've got a lot of students from JPM 333. We've been talking about languages and scripts. We're very excited to have you here as our first speaker. We've got a record audience, I think, between hybrid and in person. We're very, very delighted to welcome Professor Williams, both to ASU and to our series today. I'll step out of the way.
Thank you so much for that great introduction, Will. I think nobody objects. I might take off my mask. I'm appropriately distanced from everybody in this room, so don't worry. Except for Will. Stay away, Will. Yeah. Stay away, Will. It's not a great background, huh? So I hope everybody can see my PowerPoint. And let's see, online and in person. It's going to be a little tricky to keep track of, but thank you for that great introduction, Will. And I'm really excited to be here. Really excited to be at ASU and also to have this chance to give this talk. So this is a project that I started working on a few years ago, and I had this great fellowship to work on it in Kyoto, starting in 2019. So I was like sailing along, gathering all kinds of great materials, meeting lots of interesting scholars, making tons of progress quickly. And then suddenly, the libraries closed, the schools closed, eventually the cafes closed, and then it was just impossible to do any work at all. So this project has suffered some setbacks, but I'm really excited that Will gave me this chance to talk about it and to get back to it, and hope that I'll get some great feedback from everybody as I continue to work on it. So my topic is Kukai on Truth versus Beauty, and that's the title that I came up with when Will messaged me when I was at the airport picking up my mother. So it was a little hasty version of the title, and it's kind of a shorthand for the conflicts that you see in traditional Chinese and Japanese culture between the the search for enlightenment, as in Buddhism, and various kinds of cultural forms, artistic expression, literature. One of the ones we'll be especially concerned with here is basically like classical Chinese rhetoric. So the tradition of writing in classical Chinese, referring to the Confucian classics, the Taoist classics, etc., is a kind of beauty, a kind of cultural expression which sometimes comes into conflict with the search for enlightenment and wisdom. So I think I have way too many materials for the next 20 or 25 minutes. So we'll see. I'll definitely have to skip some things. But I'm starting out not with Kukai, but with Zhuangzi, with a passage from Zhuangzi, which illustrates this kind of conflict. this kind of tension between the like enlightenment and art and form. So, oops, well, the director of the Center for Asian Research is in the waiting room. I admitted her. So this is a passage from the Chinese Taoist classic Zhuangzi. The Yellow Emperor was wandering north of the Red Water when he ascended the heights of Kunlun Mountain and gazed toward the south. As he was returning home, he lost his pearl of mystery. So symbolizing like kind of enlightenment, understanding of really profound things. Knowledge was sent to search for the pearl, but he couldn't find it. Spider Sight, who has perfect vision of everything, was sent to search for the pearl, but he couldn't find it. Shameless was sent to search for the pearl, but he couldn't find it. Whereupon Imageless, or Xiangwang, was sent, and he found it. Extraordinary, said the Yellow Emperor. In the end, it was Imageless who was able to find it. So the point of this little fable, or one point of it, is that all these other kinds of tools that we have, like knowledge, intelligence, vision, fame, I guess, may not be the best way to attain the real kind of enlightenment, because that lies somewhere beyond forms, beyond images. So like you're not going to get to it with true wisdom just by like looking at beautiful things. You need to go somewhere beyond that. And that's symbolized especially in this word, xianghuang. So this is from a Taoist classic. And then it keeps being referred to pretty frequently by Chinese writers, both in Taoist and in Buddhist context. So it has much broader applicability. It's not just referring to the, or it develops into a kind of symbol, this imageless that can be used in non-Taoist contexts, also for Buddhist enlightenment. So this is an example of this kind of fundamental tension. And the Zhuangzi is funny because it includes all these like amusing or beautiful stories used to illustrate this kind of lesson. So it's like, it's all about this paradox that you actually have to use these tools of language and art in order to show the way to enlightenment and then ultimately get beyond all of them. But then later texts, later writers think about this problem in a different way. And so ultimately, I'm going to try to show that Kukai has a different take on this same kind of tension. There's much more to say about how it develops just in China. So, so you have the Zhuangzi expressing these kinds of ideas in ancient times. Then Buddhism comes to China in the Han Dynasty. For a brief time, there's this kind of synthesis of Taoism and Buddhism in Xuanxue, who are also, and the writers of this time are also writing poems and other kinds of literary expression that's about this search for enlightenment in kind of Zhuangzian fashion. But then there's a lot of resistance to Buddhism, and Taoism and Buddhism come into conflict. And then later there are Confucian or government imperial attacks on Buddhism. So there's this tension keeps evolving in complex ways just in China. And that's all in the background in medieval Japan, where so Buddhism comes to Japan a little bit later. And again, we see the Buddhism and the truth of Buddhism in various kinds of cultural forms, sometimes in tension. So this is a little bit anachronistic. This is a little bit later than the period I'll be talking about mostly, but I think it's a good visual illustration of this, this conflict. This is like a picture scroll of the tale of Issei Monogatari, that somebody owned and then covered entirely in this, like practicing his Sanskrit script, the Siddham script, expressing the truth of Buddhism, and canceling out the original, the great story and the great illustrations of this Japanese literary work. So more generally, in the early Japan, the Nara and Heian periods, although Buddhism was the dominant religion, it was seen as more for private salvation than for the sort of public culture. And I think that's pretty broadly true of the literary works that survive from this early period in Japan. So both the public works that are in the kanbun, in the Chinese characters, written in Chinese characters by the officials, mostly male, all male, and then also the various kinds of creative literature in Japanese kana, written by both men and women that survive. So like the Issei Monogatari I mentioned, or the Tale of Genji, many other literary works. The Buddhism, there's an influence of Buddhism, but it's kind of in the background in most of these literary works, with one important exception. So, and that is our hero today, Kukai, the Japanese monk, who has he has a unique place in this very complex, cultural, religious, literary history in the first millennium in China and Japan. Kukai, he fits into this context, but then he's quite unique, quite different from all of these other writers and thinkers who went before him. So he was later on, he was very important in Japanese history because he founded this Shingon school of Buddhism in Japan. He brought back the Shingon teachings from China, where he only stayed for less than 2 years. So it was the most productive foreign exchange student in the history of the world. And then back in Japan, he has all kinds of different accomplishments in Japan, way too many to name. But he was the director or founder of various temples and temple complexes. He's a very prolific writer of the kanbun, a great calligrapher. Then later on, he even becomes this kind of culture hero, and all this mythology grows up about him, like he was the inventor of the Japanese kana syllabary writing system. And I think I went to a place where he put down his rod, and then a fountain of water sprang up, which is still there. So there are all kinds of great stories about him like that in Japan, in addition to his more historically attested accomplishments. So that's Kukai. And just very quick, this isn't the main focus of my talk today, but it's kind of an integral part of Kukai's achievement, is that he's this very Japanese cultural hero, but he's also very, very cosmopolitan by any standard. So one of his big achievements was bringing back this Siddham script, which is like a fancy font for writing Sanskrit in. And so on the left is a page from one of his books explaining the meaning of the Sanskrit alphabet in a totally kind of nonsensical way. But anyway, and then it's partly because of his influence that there are all these tombs throughout Japan that have these same letters on them, symbolizing various Buddhist truths. And this is one of the buildings from his great temple complex at Mount Koya. This, this is I think this particular building is supposed to be kind of an architectural expression of Kukai's esoteric teachings. There are these two opposed worlds. There's the diamond-like mandala and the womb-like mandala, which are the two fundamental views of reality. And unfortunately, I'm going to skip over most of that Shingon theory, because that's all kind of beyond my expertise. But these are just some suggestions of Kukai's many accomplishments. So these huge buildings all over Japan rose out of the ground thanks to his inspiration. But for my purposes, as a teacher, translator, student of classical Chinese literature, the most important thing about Kukai really is that these are his collected works, the Kobo Daishi Zenshu. And we say he's a Japanese monk now, but these collected works are 100% entirely written in Chinese characters, except for a few random Sanskrit letters. But there isn't a word of what we would call today Japanese in the books, except maybe an introduction by some modern scholar. His writings are all in kanbun, classical Chinese. And, and this is his collected works with like minimal annotation too. So he's a very prolific writer of classical Chinese in many different genres. And it's so from that point of view that I want to talk about him today, and his writings in classical Chinese and the kind of perspective that they take on these fundamental issues, religion and art and culture, including this art of writing classical Chinese itself. And to do that, out of all those collected works, I'm just going to focus on one, which is probably his first extant composition by Kukai. So it's called the Sango Shieki, and this the title has this funny Buddhist pronunciation, if you know Japanese. So that's why it's not Sankyo Shiki or something. It's Sango Shieki, which also has an alternate title called the Rogo Shiki. I guess that would be ultimate meaning for the deaf and blind. So the ultimate, it's kind of abbreviated, ultimate meaning of Buddhism, or of the three teachings for the deaf and blind, I guess. But the more common title, the ultimate meaning of the three teachings, is basically referring to Confucianism, Taoism, and Buddhism, and explaining their ultimate truth, which of course is Buddhism. So at the end, he ends up with Buddhism. And this was completed at the end of 797, when Kukai was in his early 20s. It may have been revised later on after he went to China. So there may be some elements that express his sort of later ideas a little bit too, but it's mainly just composed in isolation when he was very young, based on his very extensive studies of Chinese as a young man. It's set up as a fictional dialogue. So there are these 5 characters named Lord Hair Tusk, Young Lord Leech Fang, Master Tortoise Fur, Imaginary Recluse, and Anonymous Beggar Boy. And so the last 2 names indicate very clearly that they are imaginary, they're not real people. The first 3 names do too, but more indirectly, because leeches don't have fangs, tortoises don't have fur, and hares don't have tusks. And these are actually, this is like a kind of insanely clever allusion to the Diamond Sutra, which mentions all of these things as impossible items. And then he chooses them as the names of his 3 characters to show that they're all imaginary. And so the characters give speeches. Well, the young Lord Leech Fang doesn't give a speech. He's just supposed to be a very naughty, callow youth who doesn't understand anything and spends all his time drinking and gambling. And then these other experts, his uncle, Lord Hairtusk, calls in these other experts to sort of get him to shape up and give him, morally edifying speeches. So from these 3 points of view. So it has this dramatic setup, and then one by one, each of the speeches is persuasive, and then at the end, the Buddhist speech persuades everybody, and they all agree that Buddhism is the best solution of all to the problems of life. And the Japanese scholarship generally points out that this anonymous beggar boy is a stand-in for the perspective of Kukai, right? So he's also, well, a young man, maybe not a boy, but when he's writing this, and it's supposed to be explaining why he converted and became a monk, not converted, but why he chose to become a monk, to devote his life to Buddhism, rather than becoming like an official or a scholar, as he also could have done. So it's supposed to be autobiographical and explaining why he rejected these other alternatives and chose a career as a monk. But I realized just while I was preparing this presentation, I realized that there's no reason not to think that all the characters are expressing elements of Kukai as a person, very much including the nephew, because we don't really know that much about what Kukai was doing when he was like a teenager and before he became a monk. So it's very much possible that he was actually he's really thinking of himself as the person who's like gradually being persuaded, and that's something that one challenge in studying Kukai is that most of the really important scholarship about him is by these Japanese professors who are also like Shingon priests, like in his own Buddhist tradition. So they worship him basically as a kind of god, or at least like a demigod. Like there's this altar where their candles are lit constantly 24/7 in waiting for him to be reborn in Mount Koya. And there's like a university right nearby where they study him, but they also kind of worship him. So they take it's a little hard for them to adopt a more objective view of him in some respects, I think, even though they're great scholars of his work. So I was just thinking that we shouldn't limit it to the anonymous baker boy. All the characters really are expressing elements of Kukai's personality and his life story, perhaps. And I think I mentioned, but Kukai, one of his many achievements and reasons for his fame is calligraphy. So this is supposed to be his actual inscription of the earlier version of this text. So it's the Rogo Shiiki, not the Sango Shiiki. And he's like this incredibly, very like creative calligrapher. You can see like even without knowing about this text or anything, it's just very, his calligraphy is very exciting, dramatic. So this piece, the Sango Shiiki, is quite long. It's not long by the terms of like a modern novel or anything, but it's quite long for a piece in classical Chinese. It must be like 30 pages of classical Chinese or something like that. And it's has quite an elaborate structure. So there's a little preface in the voice of Kukai himself, explaining why he wrote it. Then there's the first speech of Master Tortoisefur, then the speech of the recluse, the Taoist perspective, then the speech of the anonymous beggar boy, which is much more elaborate than the other speeches. So that is actually like divided up into multiple parts and contains all these different genres. And here, I mean, Kukai, throughout this, he's really just like showing off as much as he can. So there's a long letter that the boy writes about why he decided that Buddhism was compatible with filial piety in the like Confucian sense. And then there's a short poem. Then there are two fu or rhapsodies. So this is very important type of medieval Chinese literature. The long, basically a long descriptive poem called a fu, or we translate the term as rhapsody in English sometimes. And he puts in two of those. So I mean, it's really overkill, right? Like he's just trying to show off in every way he can that he's just such an amazing writer of classical Chinese, of Kanban. And then at the end, there's a little poem, like again, just to cap things off, 10-rhyme poem. So this very elaborate structure. This structure in some ways is borrowing from this Chinese tradition of the fu genre that I just mentioned. So back from the Han Dynasty, in which you have a lot of similar examples actually. So these aren't Buddhist poems, but they're poems, for example, they're poems about the imperial capital. And so you have one speaker saying, I come from the court of Wu and we have this beautiful garden there. And then the next speaker says, well, I come from the capital, Chang'an, and we have a much bigger garden. And then at the end, the speaker from Wu says, oh, okay, you're right. You have the best garden. So it's like the same structure, but not about Taoism or Buddhism. So he's, one of the things Kukai is doing is he's borrowing this tradition from earlier Chinese literature. And then another thing you get is these fu poems sometimes have like kind of a moralistic conclusion, which is also something that Kukai is imitating here. It's like you describe all of these alternatives, and then at the end, the emperor says, no, but this is all too extravagant. Let's just let's get rid of all the pleasure gardens and turn it into fields for the peasants. And so it's like a morally improving message at the end. But before that, you had like 1,000 lines about how wonderful the park and the gardens were. So that's again like this moralistic tension in the food tradition, which we have in the Sango Shiiki too, because he's praising the Confucian and Taoist points of view so much earlier on in the poem before he gets to the Buddhist part. And so that's what my take on this piece, the Sango Shiiki, is that because of this rhetorical tradition that it's borrowing from, it's the ultimate effect of it because of the formal features and the rhetoric of the piece is a little bit different from what the content says. So it says that it's just supposed to be explaining why Buddhism is the best and the other teachings are bad, but that's not really what the message that it conveys. So one of the main messages it conveys is just that all of these different points of view, aspects of the physical phenomenal world, they're all part of the process of attaining enlightenment. So in the end, I think he's explicitly not rejecting the Confucian and Taoist teachings. He's saying they're just like the earlier stages in achieving Buddhist enlightenment. And so that's this kind of progressive view of the route to enlightenment is one element of the Sango Shiiki that is a different response, a different take on the tension between truth and beauty that I mentioned at the beginning. And then another one is just the role of this classical Chinese rhetoric in the whole piece, because it's written in this extraordinarily elaborate Kanban style. And so now for let's see, I take a few more minutes to go over my examples and then maybe just wrap up so there's plenty of time for questions. With plans to go until 12, is there? Yeah, about 12, okay. Okay, yeah, so I have a few, a few different passages from the piece that and I'll introduce like a couple of them probably, and then do my conclusion. It's so my colleague Lucas and I, who I can see he's also in attendance, we like to present papers about like short lyric poems, because you read the poem, that takes 2 minutes, you interpret it, that takes like 5 minutes. You can even do a few poems. If it's a 15-minute talk, you can just do 1 or 2 poems. If you have an hour, you could do 3 or 4 or 5 or something. But this work is tricky to do that way because it's so long. And also the length and the this kind of Baroque elaborate style is part of the meaning of the text. So I want to read a couple of passages to give you a sense of this. So this is kind of a weird passage from the first speech from Master Tortoise Fur. So it's supposed to be explaining part of this Buddhist perspective, but it uses quite a few obscure Buddhist allusions. So it says, "Thus sagely wisdom is like the Udumbara flower, which only blooms once. It's equally rare. While ignorance and idiocy are as plentiful as trees of the dung forest. So the species of men who aspire for good are rare as the unicorn's horn, but the type who wallow in wickedness, massed together like the dragon's scales. Deportment and behavior are various as stars, thoughts and habits different as faces. Jade and pebbles must follow different courses, being divided up into 9 far separated ranks. The mad and the wise each have their own spheres, which are removed some 30 leagues apart. Each is inclined towards his own preferences as naturally as a pebble falling into a pond, and yet all proceed towards what they detest, like grease sprinkled over water." So this is basically is supposed to be saying something about how the Confucian type of sage is very rare, and most people are not capable of the same kind of sagely wisdom and perfection. But it actually all applies to his Buddhist ideas too. So, and that's, well, just from the content, it all applies similarly to Kukai's view of, how to become a Buddhist, how to become a proper Buddhist. And he includes several allusions. So at the beginning, the udumbara flower, and then at the end, the pebble falling into a pond and the grease sprinkled over water, both come from Buddhist sutras. So they're both also about like the quality for the pebble is like about enlightenment, the rareness of enlightenment. And then the grease sprinkled over water is also, about there's so many vices and dangers to enlightenment. And so what I also want to do here, though, is point out something about how this is written. So the kanbun. So it's written. The texts are all in Chinese characters, right? But that's not how people read it in Japan, and probably not how most people read it even when Kukai was writing it, right? So this is an example. Let's see. So the Chinese, if you read it in Chinese, it's like 与世闲置如柚花，春吃肉等干，是故养山之类，游溪鳞角，丹雾之流，既遇龙鳞，操行入心，一去一面。玉水殊途，要分九等，狂者别区，远隔萨里，各取所好，如水投水，并复所恶，色之沃水。But then in Japanese, it sounds totally different. So, koko ni oite kenchi wa uge no gotoku, shochi wa toukan no gotoshi, yoshi o aogu no tagui wa nao rinkaku yorimo mai ni, and so on. So that's a modern kundoku reading by a modern Japanese scholar, but basically he rearranges the order of the words and adds all of these different grammatical particles and even verbs, and the sound effects are completely different. And so one kind of puzzle that we talk about in our department sometimes is like, what to describe this as, this phenomenon. It's like the text looks the same, but you can read it in two completely different languages, make it sound completely different. And I keep thinking about this, and I don't have a really good solution. It's especially hard with Kukai because he was completely fluent in Chinese, so he could have read it in Chinese too. So it's, but one thing I noticed about this passage, I feel like it actually works better in Japanese than in Chinese. In Chinese, there are some odd places that are not quite as elegant, like it repeats the shui at the end of the last two lines, which seems weird, I think, from the point of view of Chinese rhetoric, the water. That's something I'm still thinking about, whether it's possibly intended to sound the best to the Japanese reader. I mean, that would make sense. It should be intended to sound better to the Japanese reader than to the Chinese one, but that's a challenge. So then I'll give a couple of quick examples. So there's a long passage about all of these Taoists, mushrooms and herbs that you can use to stay healthy and extend your life. And the telling thing about this is that Kukai he's so enthusiastic about describing these Taoist practices. When in theory, he shouldn't be, they're not even actually like really active in Japan at the time that he's there. It's like he's getting it entirely from the text that he's reading, but he's so enthusiastic about it. So you have the white hill thistle, yellow germ, pine resin, and paper mulberry fruits, all to relieve the inner diseases, and so on and so on. And so I mean, ideally, I would like read this to you for 2 hours just to give you a sense of how long and elaborate it is. But I'm going to skip this Taoist part. Then, I mean, this is just a random selection. It goes on much longer. Then I want to give you just a little bit of this rhapsody. Wait, no, I can't see it because, Rhapsody on the Ocean of Life and Death. So there are two of these Fu rhapsodies. And this is just the beginning of the Rhapsody on the Ocean. And again, this is like a Buddhist poem within the Sango Shieki, which is also using the same techniques and using this really elaborate description. So life and death comprise an ocean encompassed by the margins of the three types of beings, which are without limit the farther you gaze. So talking about the vastness of the universe. And then the waves rising high as a mountain range crash and smash ceaselessly. The billows surpassing mountain slopes rush one after the other, stupendous in scale, crashing and smashing, and so on and so on. And talking about the vastness of the ocean of life and death. And then he has these long passages about different kinds of animals and beings and how they're all, damned and, going to suffer for, another billion lifetimes before they can reach enlightenment. These are just the scaly creatures, they're like enormous leviathans, and they don't understand about, the Buddhist teachings and Buddhist compassion, and so they're just going to keep on repeating their terrible lives. And then there are these, in the Buddhist part, there are these just elaborate poetical passages about mortality. That's a big theme throughout, really. It's just these different ways of confronting the fear of death. And so I especially like this one, where he says, "Your nearest and dearest wife and children are no more real than the goddess that Song Yu met in a dream in Chu," which is kind of a funny, uncontextual allusion to this romantic poem from China again. So one of the things he does throughout is he mixes up allusions and references that I think in Chinese text normally would be kept separate, but he for Kukai he can mix them up in fascinating ways. And the wind whistles through the pines, brushing upon the collar with a soughing sound. But those ears that listened to it with delight, where have they gone now? The moon's crystal gleam amid cinnamon bows flickers lovably upon human faces, but what has become today of the mind delighting in that vision? So this is all within the Buddhist section of the Sangha Shieki, talking about the inevitability of death and how Buddhism provides the only consolation at the end. Even though, he's only in his early 20s and, starting out on this very brilliant career. So that's this going very quickly over this first piece by Kukai. There's a question which is still very open, but which I've been thinking about how this plays out in his later life and later on in Japanese history. One of the weird things about this text is that, so the author is very famous in Japan, but I don't think, basically nobody reads this piece, the Sango Shieki. For most of history, people haven't read it that much because it's very difficult. So I can only read it thanks to all of these annotations done by many centuries of scholars, and sort of an ordinary Japanese Buddhist would have no hope of getting anything from it. But I feel like there is it expresses some ideas which then Kukai works out in more detail later on in his life. So it anticipates some of his later work and achievements. So there are some direct parallels with his greatest Buddhist treatise, which is the 10 abiding stages of the mind of the secret mandala. So as you would expect, in the first two stages, the earliest, most primitive stages, there are some parallels to this Buddhist, Confucian and Taoist elements in the Sango Shieki. But then by that time, he has many more stages of Buddhism to add on. And then he has a treatise about Chinese poetics called the Bunkyo Hifuron, which is important for people studying Chinese literature, and the Sango Shieki anticipates that by showing us about his vast knowledge of Chinese literature. But it's not a particularly influential text, the Sango Shieki, on Japanese literature, as far as I know. But at the same time, this idea that so the truth and beauty, so the forms of the world play a role in your journey to enlightenment, and you shouldn't just reject them. I think that's important. And that's something it's very important in Shingon Buddhism, which has some really fantastic works of art. In particular, it has this tradition of the mandala. So these elaborate kind of Buddhist diagrams of many different Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. And that's which Kukai brought many of these back from China, and then, in the Shingon church, they produced many more of them in Japan. So that's an element of the Kukai's later life and his influence on Japanese culture, which is, I think, anticipated a bit in this Sango Shieki itself. And this is from right after Kukai's own time, this mandala. So I think I'll end there with this nice picture, and happy to take questions and hear more from all of you.
Thank you very much. This was a wonderful, wonderful talk. Just capacious, very cosmopolitan, really nice way to embark on our series. Thank you very much for this. Maybe
Oh yeah.
So Q&A will be a little bit complicated, I guess, with the hybrid. I was thinking maybe I could man electronic questions over here. If you wouldn't mind repeating the question, just so people on Zoom can hear if something comes from here. But we'll open up for Q&A. So regardless, whether it's the chat, or if you would like to do the analog thing here, or log on here and do the chat, however we want to do it, we'll figure out a way. But if you wouldn't mind, Nick, just repeating any questions.
Sure.
Yeah. So it's, questions. Yes, Jenna.
For this fascinating talk, and I have actually 3 questions. So the first question is actually about theory, or how we approach this problem of free teachings, Sanjiao. So Timothy Brook has a theory about this transition of how people view Sanjiao from early medieval China to late imperial China. So his argument is basically that before the Yuan dynasty, the narratives tend to be more compartmentalist. So which means people talk about how the three teachings can function in different aspects of people's life. And after the Yuan, it's more like the three teachings are really merged into one thing, and this kind of compartmentalist logic lost its appeal. And I wonder, does this text from Kukai tell us something about this compartmentalist logic, or see that?
Well, that's a good question. So the question is about theory by Timothy Brook about the change in the views of the three teachings across Chinese history. I'm not going to repeat the whole hypothesis. I think so. So this is one thing that I've been trying to inform myself about for this study is, and I have no opinion about the issue after the Tang Dynasty, but in medieval China, there's this pretty vigorous debate, especially in the 6 dynasties and then still continuing in the Tang, about the relations between the 3 teachings, right? So compartmentalized. I would say there are lots of different facets to it, because one of the inspirations for this work by Kukai is there are all these essays that have like a dialogue between a couple of characters, like a Taoist and a Buddhist, arguing about which teaching is correct. And at first, you would think that Kukai's piece is modeled on those. But those mostly aren't like serious debates. Usually it's like, the Taoist asks some questions, and then the Buddhist tells him, no, that this is why all everything you think is wrong, and Buddhism is correct. So or the opposite, or the reverse. So in the way I think about it is that in China, these had like Buddhism and Taoism both had their own clergy, they had their own institutions, they were either getting support from the government, or were sometimes were facing persecution from the government. So they had a lot of really concrete institutional interests that were in conflict, and which were underlying some of these debates that you see in the textual tradition. And in Japan, the situation wasn't at all the same because the emperor, the imperial family were Buddhists and supporting Buddhism, and there wasn't a Taoist church. There wasn't that kind of conflict. So that's one of the reasons that Kukai can take such a totally different perspective on this conflict than a Chinese writer could. It would be hard. I mean, for example, an important Buddhist monk in China would have his own temples to defend against the threat of these, competitors. So, but Kukai is writing in totally different institutional context. So, I think I'll just leave it there. There's a lot more about that, which is interesting. There's a lot of good work on these kinds of debates in China, but I didn't talk about it in my talk today, and so it would take quite a bit of effort to reconstruct some of that right now. Maybe could we have a question from someone else next, and then we can go back to you if we have more time. But I think we have. Yeah. I'll take off my.
Uninformed question, but for someone who's not in this Asian, would it be possible to make the argument that Kukai's aim was to indigenize body thinking or way of thinking, body knowledge into the Japanese context, and in a way more than just translation or writing simultaneously in multiple languages, but providing a framework justification for a particular kind of reading.
Yeah, so that's the question is, would it be possible to make the argument that Kukai was trying to indigenize the topic that he was writing about, into a particularly Japanese perspective on it. And I think, so that's the kind of argument that makes sense with a lot of other early Japanese texts. Like the what's it called? Nihon Rōki. Nihon Rōki, these stories of the salvation, kind of miracle tales from just slightly before Kukai's time. And there are lots of other texts that are kind of transplanting some Chinese or some Buddhist sources and then adapting them in different ways. But that normally would make more sense for the Japanese audience, but Kukai is doing something different. So I think it's sort of the opposite. I mean, he's almost trying to be more Chinese than the Chinese writers. And that's especially because there's this weird historical accident that Kukai is almost contemporary with these writers, Han Yu and Liu Zongyuan and their friends in the Tang in China, who were taking the Chinese writing in a totally different trajectory. So Kukai is kind of reverting more to this earlier Chinese tradition, which is just about to sort of fade out and be rejected by the Chinese writers. So yeah, it's like the phenomenon where like only the colonists living far away from the home country preserve the old dialect and the old rituals of their native country. It's like a little bit like that.
And they're very proud of it too. Like the true culture is preserved in Japan.
Yeah.
Music or Ogi Sarai making the same argument about language. Can I ask like a little just kind of addendum to that question?
Yeah.
So this is a really, really basic question. This is written before he goes to China for the most productive study abroad in human history. Does this text circulate in China? Does he bring it with him? Is there any Chinese interest in this text?
As far as I know, never.
Never.
Okay. Like absolutely never. Now, like nowadays, there are a few Chinese scholars who are doing interesting work. I think on Kukai and but yeah, it's not history. I guess, yeah, it's funny. It's like, you would think he would have brought it with him. Yeah,
I would have.
I guess. I think like a lot of these like medieval scholars, he presumably had it all memorized, so he could have even just recited it for people. But I think the people he met in China must have been impressed by his command of Chinese. But as far as I know, there's no record of this. Yeah, the reception in China. Yeah, yeah.
Other questions? We have time for a couple more, I think. Ben, please.
You said that Kukai suggested more of an integrative approach to Buddhism, that you said that it could, coexist with like piety or other Taoist ideals.
Yeah.
And, as a point of reference, I was thinking that there was points in history in the West where there was coexistence of the Abrahamic religions, right? I was just thinking there are scholars in Al-Andalus, for instance, where Islam, Christianity, Judaism had to coexist, and scholars tried to have a more integrated approach to the Abrahamic religions. Is that a similar process, or is that completely different, or like how is that interaction compared?
That's a great question. Yeah, in medieval in the West, there was kind of at least a superficially parallel situation with like scholars trying to have an integrative approach to the three Abrahamic religions and present them as not being in conflict. I guess, so that's, again, one difference, that might be a little bit more like the issue that was raised earlier about the late imperial China, where you got kind of a synthesis of the three religions for a lot of three teachings for, but the Kukai's text is weird because one of the teachings is kind of like totally fictional, like in his context, the Taoist. There isn't really a Taoist religion in Japan. But maybe that's why it's easier for him to work out this kind of integration and synthesis than it would be for other people. I know in medieval Europe, there are also like these interesting dialogues, like, a dialogue between a Christian and a Jew or something like that, that are kind of parallel to these Chinese works. So, but I mean, well, fundamentally, the three teachings seem a little easier to integrate than Christianity and Islam. So,
maybe one more question, Noah?
I just kind of wanted to sort of addendum on that, thinking about the Abrahamic religions, especially, is that because these religions didn't only have religious significance, but also political significance. And so I can definitely see where, because in medieval Europe and things of that nature, the Christian nation and the Islamic nation and the Jewish nation all were kind of conflicting rivals.
Yeah.
Whereas I can definitely perceive more in China, India, and Japan, they aren't necessarily warring with each other. And so I can definitely see where there would be a lot more conjoining of them versus the warring nations of the West.
That's right. Yeah. So for the most part, I mean, in East Asia, you don't have situations where you have like, Buddhist and Taoist cities going to war with each other, any kind of like direct violent conflict on that scale. And then another thing is you have this solution that I think I alluded to very briefly, which is like this kind of compromise that the Confucian teachings are for the public behavior and politics, and then Taoism and Buddhism are more for your inner private salvation, because it's a little bit like the Enlightenment, the Western Enlightenment, and the freedom of religion, but not that would be going too far. That is you do. That's the basic thing that allows them to coexist a lot of the time. and it's so that there's the political tensions are there, but they're not as violent or as direct. Yeah.
We're right at
Okay.
12. Maybe this would be a good time to wrap things up. And once again, thank our speaker for a really wonderful, very cosmopolitan speech with lots of points of commonality for all of us in different fields. So also to our wonderful audience, thank you all very much for coming. We'll have more events very soon. Just kind of keep your inboxes peeled, I guess. Ears and inboxes peeled. Professor Schober, would you like to make any final announcements? Or
Well, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
Notice, Professor Williams, this is your first semester, and so we're really appreciative of your time and expertise. And thank you very much for being here today. I want to thank John Lynn and Will Hedberg for organizing the series. I want to thank you and the folks online for being there. And I want to alert you to another series that is on global Asia that will go through this semester and the next semester with different speakers. All of those will be online, but very interesting topics as well. And finally, I want to announce for our faculty affiliates at the center that we will have a faculty meeting next Friday, to which you're all invited to discuss our Title VI application and matters relating to that. So please do join us for all of those events. We're working out our technical realities here virtually and in person, and I'm sure that the more we do it, the better we get at it. So bear with us, and thank you for being here today.
Thanks to everybody on Zoom. Hope you're able to hear